Good afternoon. Thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be back at this incredible symposium. There's just too much to learn, Chris. That's the hard part about this. I think we've all seen that AI holds unbridled potential for improving the health of patients and all of our families and friends around the world. The question really is, how do we think about the regulatory aspects of artificial intelligence? It does have a bit of a twist. Chris mentioned that I've spent a little time in my career working through regulatory channels in implantable vascular devices. And so when you think about that, the pathway is relatively straightforward and clear. You have a device, you decide how to manufacture it, you decide the market that you're testing the device for, you set up the population of patients in whom you want to show if your device works or not, you run a clinical trial under regulatory oversight, you generate data that's objectively assessed, you submit that data, and if you've done a good job and meet all the safety and efficacy endpoints, your device gets approved for sale and use in humans. But think about machine learning, for example. You start with an algorithm that begins today. You start feeding information into this algorithm to generate results. Over time, the algorithm evolves. It generates new approaches. It thinks about things a different way. And so what started out as algorithm A might be algorithm C in a short period of time, and then algorithm F shortly thereafter. And what challenges does that pose to the regulatory framework for machine learning and this entire field of artificial intelligence? So I'm joined by an incredible panel of folks who have given a lot of thought towards this area. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, give them a chance to give some background to you of what they do in their day jobs and how they think about regulatory aspects of artificial intelligence. And I'll start with my colleague, Fabien.
Hi, thank you very much. So my name is Fabien Beckers. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Arterys. In short, we do AI for medical imaging, but in truth, we do so much more than that. A lot of people talked about medical imaging because it's such a beautiful opportunity for AI to really improve patient care and hospitals and health system in general. The problem that we have today in the world is that the structure that was built for medical imaging in the last 40 years is not well suited for really AI and big data. So we think it's about kind of applying iPhone apps on an old flip phone. It's not really the best system. And so we conceive for the last 5 years a cloud-based platform tailored for this new world of AI and big data, where you send the data to the cloud, we manage data privacy, you open a browser, you have AI to augment you, you can always modify and change things and send things back to whatever a hospital needs to have in order to host the report of the physician. And we've done 25,000 patients, we have raised 45 million, we're an 80 people base and started at Stanford, and we got 5 FDA clearances, class 2, and I think we're the first company to got a cloud-based system with an FDA clearance for deep learning in the cardiac space. And so we really have gone through the not fun, not hype part of the equation to really get deep learning not as an algorithm, but as a true clinical solution, solving clinical needs and respecting the FDA framework and make sure and proven that it can be done. And today we are live in almost 100 hospitals around the world that use Arterys as a clinical tool on a daily basis.
So good afternoon. My name is Hilary Malone. I'm the Chief Regulatory Officer for Sanofi. Sanofi is what you might consider as a traditional big pharma company. We have over 3,000 products going back to 1960. We market in over 90 countries across the world. We have drugs, devices, consumer healthcare brands, over-the-counter brands. And obviously, one of the things I'm deeply interested in as a career sort of drug developer, if you like, is how AI can impact everything in that paradigm, both drug discovery, drug development, and on obvious access to patients and informing physicians in terms of the medical utility of different solutions. Although one of the things I think is going to be really interesting to discuss in this panel is how we can use AI to actually think about the regulatory process itself. The regulatory process that we work with today has essentially been designed in the 1960s for 1960s drugs. And the cycle times that we had then compared to the cycle times that we will have now, and the opportunities that AI gives us in improving those cycle times really means that we have to think about the regulatory process per se, both for new drugs and devices and also on-market products, and how we can really fundamentally think about how do we use AI to think about smarter digital regulation rather than the analog regulation of the 60s.
Hello, Todd McNitt. I'm with GE Healthcare, and I have, I think, the luxurious job of leading an initiative around co-developing AI applications from ideation, whiteboarding session, all the way through smart machine, regulatory approach, and how we're going to introduce them into workflows. After 20 plus years in healthcare IT, and reflecting on the last 2 years of AI and where this started, I think as an industry, we're obviously still pretty early in the application of AI. The technology, largely though, I think has been proven to have amazing potential. At the base of that, and I think we'll get into this discussion, is the ground truth of that data, right? What kind of data sets, validation process, learning algorithms is a new concept, right, in healthcare. How do we continue to evolve the data, the validation, move that into a clinical application that's effective and actually has the outcomes that truly change healthcare? So I'm in the middle of all those pieces of it. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, good afternoon. This is Bakul Patel. I'm this Associate Director for Digital Health. So as the title sort of expounds, I lead all digital health efforts, and AI happens to be one of the things that I have to figure out by how we should look at, what should we consider, and how we should be thinking about going forward in our approaches we take. Fundamentally, FDA is a scientific organization. It cares a lot about safety, cares a lot about effectiveness and efficacy. But I agree with my panelists that I think it's time for us to look at, if we were to have that same goal as people have for providing access to patients with high quality tools. And when I say tools and products, I mean the same. In the drug world, it's about drugs. In medical device worlds, it's about medical devices. I think we are on a cusp of thinking about how can we think about software that is a medical device, or software as a medical device, and how can we allow that to be accessible to patients that we all care about so dearly. So we've been on this journey since 2012, 10 mostly, and we had been clearing and been clarifying our policies all along. But now is the time. Last July, actually, we started to imagine a paradigm where we think about not just products, but also the organizations that build those products, and how can we sort of leverage that information and look at an entire life cycle of how medical products reach patients, how technologies are conceived to actually delivered and maintained over the life cycle. So what's the structure look like? So we have, and if people have not seen this, we have piloted a program called Precertification, which based on a concept of if you're a TSA pre-check, we know who you are from a trusted partner or trusted organization perspective. Can we afford that credit back to those excellent organizations that can then be availed a different regulatory structure or different review that can become the enabler for getting products to the marketplace? Not about just getting products to the marketplace, but also learning from how these technologies, when I say these technologies, I'm very focused on software and digital health, where connectivity is like baked in to the product itself. Knowing the patient is baked in. How do we leverage that? How do you bring that together? And how do we think about it from learning system and learning regulatory paradigm as well? So that's what we've been doing in the space, and we are right in the middle of developing this program. In fact, January, end of January, we had this session where we said by end of this year, we'll have a version 1 of this program. We'll iterate and learn. And it's an opportunity for not just FDA, but also everybody in this area wanting AI to be successful, wanting software to be successful, to help and participate and help us build it in the right way. So I'm here actually to learn a lot, and hopefully we can add to this conversation of how can we teach each other and build a regulatory system that can sort of leverage some of the technology that's in front of us.
So you can see why we're excited about the expertise that's on the stage here. Let me go back to you, Bakul, because we can't really start on a regulatory discussion without starting with the regulators. So let me just ask you, 2010, you start this group at the FDA. What was the vision at the time? What was the thought? How many people? And tell us a little bit about, give us an under-the-cover look at how it's evolved over the past 8 years, in addition to what you just mentioned about these new initiatives.
So we started off with very simplistic mission about providing clarity, continued clarity on the world that was erupting in front of us called mobile apps. And mobile apps and the term mobile medical apps was coined by my center. We wrote a document that's clearly clarified. So what came right after that was the need for continuously providing the clarity. And we're at a point, and you can see the history, every 6 months, it's almost to the same tune as iPhones sort of and phones sort of come to the marketplace. We had the need to provide at least 2 guidances every year since then. And that's a representation of this field is evolving so quickly. We didn't have an idea of I was an army of one. We didn't have an idea of having a team, and it was good enough at that point. But we quickly realized that the engagement that's needed in this community to allow the innovation to happen while encouraging patient engagement and keeping patients in the center was important. And we started slowly growing from 1 to 3 and started giving that customer service that people had questions about the guidance we just published and what should we do about this before actually even entering them in the regulatory pathway. So we started doing that. To date, I can tell you, like, we've answered more than 1,500 questions. We get about 20 a month or so on an average. But that's the kind of thing that we sort of introduced to the agency and continue to sort of be in the know, be connected with the community who's actually building these products. So that was something that we learned along the way. Pretty soon, we also realized this was not just local in the US, had to be international. So one thing that we had to do was work with our partners across the globe and come up with a common framework that we can all understand what should we start from? What's the same sheet of paper we had to start on? And that's the work that we've done over since 2013 to now, on starting with vocabulary to what should a quality systems look like to what should a clinical evaluation look like for software. And that becomes a foundation for every regulator across the globe to sort of take that and move to the next level. So we not only did something in the US, but we also did globally. And now we have an opportunity to say, okay, we clarified what is and what is not a medical device, where we would engage, where we would not engage, where is important, where is not important. But now is the time where we had to really think about creating a paradigm that is best amenable for these products to be in the marketplace. And actually, to some extent, not leaving stuff on the table that can be learned from, both as a healthcare system or healthcare ecosystem, but also from a regulatory perspective, and even from a maker perspective or manufacturer perspective. How can we create an environment that can enable the real world experience that people have with these products? Also, can we create a system that can be scaled down the road and not just apply to a type of product that we know of today? And we are quickly finding out that now we have to fold in AI as part of this. And those concepts align, so it's a validation. So that's the journey we've been.
And I know that my 3 colleagues here will be very eager for the answer to this question, but how's it gone over the course of the 8 years with all of the other regulatory groups around the world? Has there been synergy? Has there been general agreement? Is the guidance consistent for people who've got an interest in multiple countries around the world?
Yeah, actually, I would say it's very encouraging, and I'll tell you, it's very promising. The struggle that we are having today, what we had 2013, is consistent with every country, Australia, Japan, EU, as in Commission, Canada, Brazil, Russia, China. All these countries were participating, and we published 4 guidances that sort of lays the groundwork, and not just about trying it down to a particular regulation or a particular way of thinking, but getting people on a scientific level to the same page. And that's what we have done. And I think there's a lot of, so implementation of that is the next phase, and which is what we're doing right now. I can also see what's happening is, it's a classic infrastructure question. People who have very strong, deep-rooted regulations have a hard time getting to this new world, or actually a lot more effort is required to get to the new world. People who didn't have a lot of deep regulations in medical devices, I'll use Brazil, for example, are taking the work that we have done in this forum and actually adopting it wholesale. So that's sort of the power of the convergence that has happened.
That's great. So Fabien, I'm very curious. So this is a relatively new branch of the Food and Drug Administration in an area that you've concentrated intensely in. As you said, you're the first to have a cloud-based solution that's approved. So tell us, how'd you get into this, not only from your company standpoint, but approaching the FDA, beginning this process? How's it gone?
Yeah. So the start of Arterys was really at Stanford when we realized how much variability and subjectivity you have in the care path today. I think there's studies showing that 25 to 30% of medical imaging cases are misread. And so there's a real need for equalization of quality of care in medical imaging and democratization. The piece is that if you really want to help patients and solve a clinical problem, you have to be FDA regulated. And so for us, it was very important from day one to understand how can we do so and how can we approach our product and our clinical solution rather than just AI from that standpoint. So today we're talking to large health systems that really want to be cloud AI and switch from an on-prem solution. And part of the reason why they're talking to us and working with us is regarding the fact that we have such a strong FDA angle. And there's no magic to it. Our arguments around it is that there's a skill set, there's a type of expertise you have to bring into your company. AI is really a small part of a clinical solution. It's a mean to an end, but it's like if I give you a bag of transistor and I say, go and make a phone call, it's pretty hard to do. And so what I think physicians want is the same thing. They want clinical solutions that are full, vetted, and regulated. There's guidelines that are very clear from FDA that you have to follow. And as long as you are within and your product is safe and efficacious, and you have a testing system and VNV and quality embedded into your code, and you respect your guideline, and I think the application for us was 1,800 pages to show that we are safe and efficacious. If you do that properly, you get regulated. So there's nothing magic to it. It's just that you have to understand that AI in a clinical solution, a software standpoint, is the same as any other medical device.
So Todd, on a larger scale, looking at it from GE's lens, whiteboard to through product development, how do you approach this when you have great ideas, obviously a great company with a great infrastructure, but you have this regulatory pathway to follow? What's the impact of that on your decision-making at the whiteboard level, and kind of how do you jog and weave through the process?
Yeah, great question. And I think some of it starts with we have globally a lot of great collaboration partners. So the clinical idea, the availability of the data sets, the data is unique to the problem we're trying to solve, the clinical problems. We find an interesting clinical problem to solve with our partner, or some are internal depending on the use case. We obviously need well-curated data sets. And then out of that, you start to get a determination of what is the ability of this algorithm or application. And this starts feeding into what's the medical claim or the clinical claim we can make this application. What's the risk profile of this application? How are we taking it to market? Is it going in a device? Is it a digital workflow? And I'd say all this starts steering us towards the regulatory approach for that. So there are high-value use cases that are lower risk, very clinically relevant, prioritizing work list, finding critical findings in, for example, image studies that perhaps sit in a queue for days or longer when in fact there's a critical finding. So some of these, if we think of the capability of that model, what percentage sensitivity, specificity, how do we manage risk around that and deploy it? And then at the end of the day, the validation step of that, right? So now, which we could have a whole discussion on validation. These AI algorithms are quite fragile around variance in data. Did you have the right population diversity, machine diversity, environment of IT integrations, et cetera? So assuming all that goes to plan, then the clinician at this point still is in the loop. All right, so the first phase of AI, at least coming to market today, there's still a clinician. It doesn't go from AI to operate on patient. So based on all those pieces, how capable is the model, how informational is the workflow, and then risk managed, then it comes to relatively manageable regulatory path around that, not indifferent than a lot of our current products that are more feature-based engineered. And then obviously post-market surveillance. Another new piece for probably all of us in this room is now that you have an approved product that has a deep learning neural net that can continue to learn, it's very important to get feedback from the clinical use of this model to understand how to improve it. Even if it's a static, approved, gold standard model, you want to continue to get the feedback to it. So even if it's an offline process to update and build new models. So there's a new muscle around collecting the clinical feedback around that model.
So Bakul's watching the clock. He's got to catch a flight, and he's going to use an old-style prehistoric technology called Uber to get him to the airport. But before you actually run, we were chatting a little bit beforehand about this concept of data. And as so much data is generated in AI, what does it actually mean? How valid is it? Is there a clearinghouse for understanding the data? Can you give us some of your insights on that?
Yeah, and there's good brainstorming we had before we got on the stage. And one of the things we were talking about is, in the world of AI, it's not the software, it's not the network, it's about the data. It's about the data, how clean it is, how good it is, how diverse it is for the outcomes that you're trying to sort of get insights into. So it becomes interesting is how do we sort of take that and create a model that a community can actually start vetting this. So there is rigor behind the data that gets gets to train the algorithm or train the network. Is there a rigor behind, separation of validation data set versus training data set? What do you do when it's overtraining? So it's all focused on the integrity, the cleanliness, sort of the rigor that goes into data itself. And then how do you use that and knowledgeably take it into whatever you get out of the learning algorithm or the algorithm itself and connect it to a clinical situation or a clinical condition. And that's really what's important in this space. It's one thing to do that same process you're doing in non-risky, like an ad world kind of situation, as opposed to when you have choices to make for patients, choices to make that could be interventional. And that's where I think the rigor needs to sort of should be focused on as well. So I think there's an opportunity here for places to sort of now start having, and I use this word very loosely, escrowing test data set that can then start testing the outcomes, not exactly making an gold standard, but really knowing is the training over time for that engine is off the rails or not. Just getting that confidence continuously is something going to be useful. So I think this is going to evolve over time. I think there's going to be, I would love to sort of see communities of data commons build up that can start sort of exchanging the information and having that rigor that goes into standardization of how to collect, how to know when it's the right kind of data you're going to use going forward.
Yeah, it's a whole expanded spectrum of core data labs that would actually evaluate something like this. Before you run, Todd made a comment about an area I'm particularly interested in, which is the post-market surveillance aspects of this. So for those of you who aren't quite as familiar, you take a medical device that's made its pre-market approval, and now there's an obligation to study that in the real world and collect objective data to see how it performs. So tell me a little bit about how the agencies thought about post-market surveillance of AI and machine learning.
So post-market surveillance is like really easy to sort of understand and grasp from a medical device or even drug perspective, right?
Yeah, that's why I understood it so easily. That's the reason, right.
So you think about, you understand what your customers are telling you about your product. You get adverse events complaints, or you get complaints, and you get some kudos, and you use that data, and you have some focus groups, and you now understand how the product's actually being run in the real life. The fact that in the world of digital health, you can imagine a world where this is what I was saying earlier, the fact that you're connected to the end user in a so intimate way that you can actually understand how long it took them to click that button on the phone, how long did they actually bypass your suggestion from the AI that was presented. To me, that's all real world performance that can sort of be brought back to the table for the product improvement, for regulatory improvement, from just a surveillance improvement. And it's not just about bad events, but how do you take the good things that we know about products, how they're being used, and how can you use that to sort of better it? So very simplistically, positive example would be like you can learn about a product, it could be any product in an extremely connected world, in the world of digital health, learn how you're doing for product performance. You can do from clinical performance, and you can do it from user performance. If you take even those three high-level buckets, instrument your product, and use that information to make your products better, eventually you could think about a scenario where that exact information could be used in addition to your obviously testing and your features to support the evidence that's needed for the next level of claim. So you could start creating this glide path, and that's exactly what we want people to do is don't start thinking about you can do everything in the world, but can you start thinking at a low levels of claim that then you can be in the market collecting real world, actually knowing what is happening with the product, and then substantiating it to going to a higher levels of claim. And that's a system we would like to see sort of happen. And that's how we've been thinking about from a real world performance and feedback mechanism that we could all use, including the regulatory bodies.
That's great. That's fabulous. So Hilary, you brought an interesting perspective to this discussion. So let's do a mind shift here from the software being the regulated product to using artificial intelligence as a pathway to two aspects that I want to cover with you. One was new drugs, new compounds, and can artificial intelligence make the process more, quote unquote, intelligent? The second one, which I thought was really impactful when we talked about it, and I'd love you to tell the audience about it, is all the products that Sanofi has currently, that every year you have certain regulatory obligations to fulfill. And it requires lots of human time, lots of hard work, lots of people power to do it. Where does AI come as a solution for that process? So give us some insights on that.
Yeah, so if I take the first part first, as we look at, and as this conference has done over the last couple of days, looked at all aspects of how AI can improve, target identification in research, how we can, be more predictive with research into identifying, drugs that really will benefit patients and have the right outcomes, how we can think about AI in clinical trials, how we can make the patient's home the clinical trial center where we can use wearables and download data continuously. So I think we've explored over the last couple of days a number of areas in the sort of drug discovery and drug development paradigm where AI can really, really help both the quality, the speed, and the cost. But essentially what we end up doing is we take all of that dynamic data that emerges over time, and from a sort of regulatory process, we then freeze it. So we stop it at a point in time. We then assimilate the data, summarize it, write it up, and often, invariably, humans writing reports. We write it up, which takes a number of months. So by the time you submit it to a regulatory authority, whether it be the FDA, the EMEA, or the Chinese FDA, essentially the data is already out of date. It's already maturing. So you then present it to a regulator who works with you, works amongst themselves, thinks about it, and anything from 4 months to 12 months later, you have an outcome on that data. It gets archived. It's already redundant for the company. It's already redundant for the agency, but it gets archived. And then we move forward. So I think we have to really think about, is that an appropriate way to assess all of those data? That's what we do now. And now with the emergence of AI and different tools, are we going to be able to think of a more progressive way of managing the regulation and the assimilation of knowledge about drugs and assessing the risk and benefit of drugs and devices and other forms of interventions, and to really think about how we can be very progressive in the way in which we regulate drugs. The other side of the coin is on the post-marketing side, and I'm not sure this audience is too aware of those types of environments, but we essentially regulate drugs that have been on the market for many, many years, for example, a statin, in the same way in a post-marketing setting as we would regulate a new monoclonal antibody, a PCSK9. But of course, the older the drug, the lower the risk, both in terms of safety risk. You've gained an awful lot of knowledge about the product, but also in terms of manufacturing robustness. So if you look at an example of Sanofi, as I said, we have over 3,000 products. We market in over 90 countries. We have over 35,000 licenses that we maintain in a very human-intensive way. I think it would be a very interesting area to explore if we take some of those lowest risk medicines and we're able to find ways of taking out the human component of maintaining those drugs on the market. Given that the data just assimilates over time, we can find ways of really taking cost out. We can find ways of taking time out, keeping the quality very high, and really creating, therefore, a bit more headspace for innovation by taking some of that human resource that you still require and some of those financial resources and either putting them back into the system or putting them back into innovation. I think one of the things that Bakul has done on the software pre-certification has been a really interesting paradigm shift where they're talking about certifying a provider rather than a product. And I think if we start to think about some of those ways of license maintenance, thinking about how you certify the provider than the product, then we can fundamentally change how we manage the life cycle maintenance of medicines and therefore put an awful lot of emphasis back onto innovation and how we can speed innovation and how we can speed new medicines to patients.
So Bakul, I think I have one more minute before you run. Are these topics on the radar screen for you?
It is on the radar screen. However, if you heard me talk previously, you'll find me very focused on software as a medical device. And I do that on purpose because as any other good project manager would do is like if you get the scope to creep out, you'll never get off the ground. And that's really, really the very focus. So I think it's a very interesting, the approach we are taking is really, really exciting. And in fact, it's so exciting that people want it now. It's like we haven't even built the product and people want it. And it's actually good validation that it's a good idea, but also it's also scary because there's a lot of hope and a lot of expectations. So I'm managing expectations to just software that is a medical device. I think you can imagine that can be applied in places that you would not imagine, right? So I'll give you a really rough, very off the medical device world or even the FDA world comment that I've heard. In the world of Federal Communications Commission, people are thinking about this idea from that angle as well, which is also interesting to sort of just see that the applicability of going to an organizational-based certification from a product-based certification has so much potential that can be delivered. And so that's a confirmation that we are on the right track. We just have to make it work. We have to make it objective, that we can't just, go into an organization, take a survey, and have a bunch of people raise their hand and say we have good processes. We have to go beyond that. And the whole idea for this, for where we're heading with this is, it's not about compliance. It's not, we are moving away from compliance to excellence. And it's how do we recognize excellence? How do you give that credit back to the people who are excellent? And what credit they can give back? What can we create in terms of credit, regulatory credit that we can give back? So that's where we're starting. And that's where you see a lot of attraction to this concept for us to go forward. So with that, I'm going to have to scoot.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. And,
Thank you.
Right. Sorry I couldn't be here long.
So Fabien, you made a comment earlier that I've got to grab onto. You said there's no magic here. There's nothing fancy. You just set up the systems, come up with the idea, have great people, good processes, done. You're approved. It's not quite like that, right? So let me dig into this a little bit. You had an idea. You started at Stanford. You had an idea. And you had this glimmer that you could actually facilitate more consistency of image interpretation that could impact positively on the quality of care patients get. There's a big drive from that idea to where you are today.
For sure.
Tell us, what were the hardest parts along that journey, particularly from the regulatory path to get to where you are?
Yes, the done part is not the easy part. But so yes, I think the important piece is really to understand when you build a startup, healthcare, and especially in clinical diagnosis. I think Arterys has been known for taking on some really very impactful clinical area like cardiovascular and cancer, and now we're going to others as well. And so it's very important that you're really solving a clinical pain point. I think that's a starting point. And then nothing about AI as a technology or as a startup, but as a mean to an end. And so that's what we've been doing. And so after that, I think when we built, first of all, realized that the platform structurally, what was problematic in the healthcare industry was really the legacy system that hospitals are dealing with. And that it was very hard to change healthcare and take it to where we want it to be data-driven and quantitative and big data on the basis of the current system that was there. And so we took on for, I think, 4 years, we didn't defocus. We really built the underlying infrastructure and plumbing, not the hype of the AI, but really the underlying system to enable that vision to translate clinically. And then after that, when we built the AI and we built the regulatory pathway, it was really about understanding what the FDA needs to achieve to make sure that you get clearance. Another part that we worked on a lot that I think will probably be interesting for a lot of the audience is regarding self-learning. So in Arterys, everything we do, or from an AI perspective, is always a suggestion, and a physician can always override that with manual tools. And for us, it's philosophically very important because the part of building AI into healthcare is down for us to only one thing: building trust. If you want to move an industry, to move a field, the trust is really the number one piece. And so for us, giving override and ways for physicians to do the same tool and the same action manually was very important. The piece that comes to it is a very interesting new function, which is building collective intelligence. When you have a physician that can change something that we propose and then learn from it. Of course, there's ramification from the FDA standpoint because we can't, from an FDA-type software, self-learn. We can self-collect. We have to go through a QA process to do all the V&V, all the same work that we do when we create a product from scratch. But we have to make sure that we fit into the release criteria, the V&V, and if either we do letter to file or resubmit if there's a change for intent for use. And so when you do all those steps and build quality as part of your dev team and learn that software engineers have to write tests and documentation, which is a very different type of software than doing pure AI, then putting all these pieces together, you have a clinical solution that can reach a physician and be integrated into a health system. It's not a fast road, but it's an investment for long term. And I think everyone in healthcare knows that it's definitely you're here for the long haul or you're not there.
And Todd, GE's got imaging in its blood. It's what you guys, one of the many things, but it's one of the things that certainly physicians have been familiar with GE. But when you think about this concept of AI making physicians smarter, better, safer, more productive, how do you actually convince the end user, the doc who's going to actually embrace this, that it's really not replacing? I mean, how do you get past that paranoia that clearly exists?
That's a great question. So if you think about the user experience, right? So now, today, I think the fundamental difference is today's system, there's a lot of semi-automation algorithms. We've had CAD products. We've had workflow enablement tools. What we largely have not had, though, is now the computer, and back to Jensen's example, right? The computer makes the algorithm, and then that in turn means that when a study is performed, whether it's an imaging study or a physiological data, the algorithm can now act in the background and actually have an inference that triggers a workflow, notifies a clinician, provides information that hadn't happened. And we see some of this with the way our iPhone works now, right? You park your car and you get to 7 minutes to home, and things just start automating in your life through your iPhone and through web experience. And there could be some similar pieces that happen in the user experience. Now, from one perspective, I think that, and from feedback from a lot of our partners and customers, they'd want to see evidence of what this machine, how it made this decision, right? Certainly in the early days, right? It's not just a black box, no output, here's a clinical decision, trust me. So visual artifacts, overlay maps, evidence around the effectiveness of what the machine saw, combined with additional data elements that exist today, right? It's not going to be out of context. Ideally, you have inference from a model, plus more context around that patient that, quite frankly, today, clinicians, even in the day of EMR, struggle to find a lot of the history around a patient. Lab results, historical exams, et cetera. So if all that is aggregated, even without AI, presented to clinician in the context of also, by the way, there's this finding from this new algorithm that has been well validated. Here's the outcome machine and some validation points of, how it got this understanding and still presented to a clinician. I think that will largely be embraced from what we're seeing. I think there is, and the further I get into this after a couple years of deep into how this comes to market, I don't think there's any fear of clinicians being replaced in quite a while, right? It's quite humbling if you sit with a radiologist, for example, and just think of what kind of nuances go through their mind just looking at a chest x-ray, right? It's not a simple binary, I found the spot, here's the result. Right, no need to look at this. There's a tremendous amount of nuanced things that have to come to account. So just picking up some pieces of that, automating a few steps, presenting better knowledge to the clinician or the radiologist, surgeon, et cetera. And then the evidence, as I mentioned, I think I think that's a valuable first step. And then Bakul mentioned something as well that I agree with largely, is that let's find the first effective entry point of the market of something that's clinically valuable, risk is managed, and then we'll learn as an industry, right? And we'll turn the automation dial, right? As we get further into it. Maybe in the future, we don't need to see every evidence piece from the machine, right? Maybe in fact, like an autopilot on a plane, I don't know if they get every feedback point, but it takes over the airplane. So it could, ideally build along that. But I think largely there's some agreement that that's the way it can progress.
So Hilary, you heard Bakul. After your comments, I asked him specifically, are you thinking about these concepts of AI as a vehicle towards new compound approval, reducing burden, things like that? And he said, sure, I'm thinking about it. We're just not working on it that hard. So are you working on it? Is your company doing more than thinking about this? Are there ways that you can prod regulatory bodies to collaborate in a way that could facilitate some of these things? Where's that going?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly we are. I think as an industry, we're all just it's a little bit like we're all beginning to see the light. We're all beginning to see the opportunities that really are presented in front of us, not just in terms of automation per se and making the easy things easy, but how we can fundamentally transform the way we develop and market and monitor drugs in the marketplace. So I think we are, starting to take sort of baby steps. I think different regulators across the world, based on their level of both need and experience, are also looking to be, somewhat more progressive. So, for example, the Chinese FDA has just completely transformed itself, going from a somewhat slow, somewhat bureaucratic, very late entrant to innovation, to essentially creating a US-type FDA, but without some of the heaviness, if you like, that some of our older institutions carry, and really looking to see how can they use technology to augment decisions, to speed decisions. So I think we're seeing in other parts of the world, we're seeing some, real willingness of governments and regulators to really engage. I think one of the things, MIT, New Digs has been working for some time, looking at progressive regulation. So how do you potentially use AI and adaptive studies to essentially be able to have some continuous clinical trial, if you like, essentially just starting with very tight controls over patient disposition and inclusion criteria, and as you learn, just continually adapting the study to a broader and broader population as you learn more and bringing in more evidence. So I think there are a number of things going on in a number of places, not necessarily always in the West. But I think we do have to, take a point in time and perhaps think about a conference like that specifically, or like this specifically on our topic of regulation and medicines, and how fundamentally can we think about changing historically the way we have thought about a product, thought about a medicine, and how we regulate it in today's world.
So on these 3 days of the World Medical Innovation Forum, we are seeing this amazing transformation of this entire field. Normally one would say, gee, we should do this again in 5 years and see where the field's evolved. I suspect if we waited 5 weeks, we'd miss something. But look into your crystal ball in our last couple of minutes, each of you. We'll start with you, Fabien, and just give us a look into your crystal ball about how do you think the regulatory components of this are going to evolve as the technology just shoots ahead? Where do you think that's going to go?
So the piece at the moment is that we're thinking about AI as really doing better what we used to do, somehow not so well today. But I think there's, as any new technology, and new framework have shown in the past, that is opened also a whole new world that we don't know today. And I think the world of big data, multimodal data, global scale of connecting healthcare and hospitals will also open some new era for healthcare and clinical diagnoses. And the question is how can, and I believe today actually the framework from the FDA standpoint is meant for it. I do think it can be softened and made more faster, or there's some rules specific to, of course, digital software. But in general, I think that's the exciting piece that we're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years, equalizing and democratizing quality of care for everyone.
Great. Hilary, your crystal ball.
So whether it's crystal ball gazing or crazy thinking, what I think we can achieve is a complete paradigm shift. At the moment, we live in a world of drug regulation where if you think about a traffic light, it's red until you get some permission to go, and then you stop again, and then you get permission to go. I think we need to turn drug regulation into green, and that there are some stoplights that you must pay attention to, but essentially we're moving forward. We create and agree a design space with regulators within which we operate to develop medicines. We have guardrails in that design space that you must stay within, and if you want to go outside, it's a much broader conversation. But I think we have an opportunity over the next 10 years to really think about fundamentally reforming what we do and to make regulation green as opposed to red.
And Todd, the last word.
Last word, excellent. So starting with what Bakul and team spoke about, and that's the pre-cert. That is a big shift, I think a very exciting initiative. So my crystal ball will be just within a few years. If that comes to pass and companies are more certified based on the quality systems, their ability to manage risk, do the good post-market surveillance, I think we see a lot more in the market of AI happening just in the next few years. So that's, I think, a big accelerator or tailwind to help push it. I think in parallel to that, there will be, just in the near term, a large number of helpful AI-based workflows in the market that may, in fact, just present a lot of information that maybe wasn't as easy to find, or some correlations that maybe weren't as easy to make without the computer. And at least that allows the clinician to start acting on data faster. And then again, we turn the automation dial up from there. So I think that all happens just in the next few years, would be my crystal ball guess.
Well, I want to thank the panel for a great conversation. We could have gone on for a lot longer. Thank you all.
Thank you.